Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Rare Genetics, Real Solutions, Connecting Patients with Clinical Trials, presented by Genome Medical. My name is Joan Wiseman, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. Just a few notes before we begin. You can access the full speaker bios from the left side of your window. Just click on the Speakers tab. If you'd like closed captions during the presentation, those are available at the bottom right corner of your video player. This webinar is being recorded, so you will have access and be able to watch it on demand within 24 hours after we finish here today. Finally, we would love to hear from you. If you have a question at any point during the presentation, please use the Q&A tab at the left side of your screen and submit your question. Time permitting, the speakers will have a Q&A session at the end. And now I'd like to introduce Sarah Reardon. She is the Vice President of Strategy at Genome Medical, and she will be moderating this webinar. Sarah, over to you.
Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you can join us for our webinar today, Rare Genetics, Real Solutions, Connecting Patients with Clinical Trials. We are looking forward to a robust discussion today. I'd like to start with the problems we're trying to solve. Likely most, if not all of you in the audience are quite familiar with the challenges clinical trials face in recruitment. But I'll point out that these problems that are familiar to many of us are actually compounded when it comes to rare genetic disease. We're talking about very small patient populations. 1 in every 10,000, maybe 1 in every 100,000 people have the disease. So these are really hard to find patients, and many patients that could be eligible are actually undiagnosed because they aren't being offered genetic testing or don't have easy access to genetic services. And with very small patient populations, it becomes much more difficult for a sponsor to achieve diversity goals. For example, every sponsor wants geographic diversity in their trials, but with such small numbers, they're really lucky to find even one patient, let alone many patients in different areas of the country. I'll also point out that with rare disease, patients and families are often quite overwhelmed with simply dealing with the day-to-day hurdles of their diagnosis. So to ask patients and families to self-advocate and seek out trials that they might be eligible for is a lot to ask. And providers are similarly overwhelmed by managing what can often be really complex symptoms, and particularly if they're not specialists in this disease state, they may not be aware of available trial or therapy opportunities or know where to look for them. And finally, while so many of us are really excited about the progress with gene therapies, many communities have a lot of fear and distrust over these novel treatments and the clinical research process in general. So we have a lot of hurdles in front of us when it comes to connecting patients with rare disease to trials and therapies. But I'm happy to report that today's webinar is not just going to be about the problems. We're going to focus on some solutions. Today, we're going to be discussing some real-life strategies that are helping to accelerate patient access to rare disease clinical trials. For example, we'll discuss how a nationwide telehealth genetic counseling and genetic testing program expanded access to therapeutic and trial options for over 9,000 patients. And we'll discuss how longitudinal clinical genetic data for over 365 rare genetic disease patients was used to identify those pre-qualified for a gene therapy trial. I can't wait to get into it, but before we do, I'd like to introduce myself and my esteemed co-presenters for today's webinar. I'm Sarah Reardon, Vice President of Strategy at Genome Medical. I'm a genetic counselor by training and have spent the majority of my career in industry roles, leading clinical programs and products at biotech and precision diagnostics organizations, such as Thermo Fisher Scientific, Life Technologies, Oncocyte, and Unified Patient Network. At Genome Medical, I lead our company's strategy in applying real-world data and genetics expertise to accelerate patient accrual for clinical trials, with a focus on rare disease. I'm delighted to be joined today by Amy Shea, Director, Diagnostics and Strategic Initiatives at Ionis Pharmaceuticals. Amy has over 20 years of experience in diagnostics and genetics. Her passion for genetics started at UC Davis, where she earned her Bachelor of Science in Genetics, before holding roles at genetics diagnostic laboratories, including Sequinome, now LabCorp, Perkin-Elmer, now Revity, and Emory Genetics. In her current role at Ionis, Amy has oversight of sponsored genetic testing and genetic counseling programs. Her team applies the science of clinical genetics to support strategic drug development and the adoption of Ionis precision medicines. I'm also joined by my colleague, Colleen Kalashu, Senior Director of Research and Real-World Data at Genome Medical. Colleen is a clinician, scientist, genetic counselor, and an internationally recognized leader in cardiovascular genetics. Colleen's research has covered use of digital tools in genomic medicine, mindfulness meditation for genetic counselors, psychotherapeutic aspects of genetic counseling, interpretation of genetic and genomic tests in cardiology, and integration of genetic counselors into cardiology. Colleen has advised multiple genetics and pharmaceutical companies on their strategy in the cardiovascular, genetic counseling, and genetic testing spaces. Before we get into the meat of today's discussion, we wanted to take a few moments to provide some background on to our respective companies. Amy, why don't you start by giving us an introduction and overview of Ionis?
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and to Genome Medical for inviting me to participate in this webinar today. I've worked with genetic laboratories and genetic counselors my whole career and feel I have been able to contribute to Ionis's mission to save and improve the lives of people living with serious diseases over the last 6 years. And I send that back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you for that, Amy. Now, I'd like to provide a little background and context about Genome Medical. We are the largest U.S. provider of telehealth genetic services. We provide genetic counseling, genetic test ordering, and patient and provider genetics education in all 50 states. We have over 65 highly experienced genetic counselors and physicians on staff who have expertise in a wide range of specialty areas, from oncology to reproductive health to cardiology to neurology, with rare disease being our fastest growing indication. We've delivered over 225,000 genetic counseling sessions. The wait time for a patient to see a genetic counselor at Genome Medical is less than 1 week, compared to the many weeks, if not months, it can take to be able to see a genetic counselor at many clinics and health systems. And of course, with a telemedicine model, that means patients can speak with a genetic counselor and have a genetic test ordered for them, all from the privacy and comfort of their own home. I want to take a few moments to discuss genetic counselors and genetic counseling for those in the audience who may be less familiar with who genetic counselors are and what we do. Genetic counselors are licensed and board-certified health professionals that help people understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and familial implications of genetic diseases. We may meet with a patient or family before genetic testing, after genetic testing, or both. During a genetic counseling session, we interpret medical and family history, we educate on genetic testing and guide families through informed decisions, and we provide support through what often are very difficult or anxious times: a pregnancy, a cancer diagnosis, a child being diagnosed with a rare disease. You'll see the quote there from our Chief Clinical Officer: "Patients come to us for guidance on often life-altering conditions. No patient ever forgets their meeting with a genetic counselor." The unique value genetic counselors bring as experts, educators, scientists, and counselors means that we can help our patients in a variety of ways, and that's really the foundation of the trusted relationship we have with our patients. At Genome Medical, we offer a suite of services to life science companies, all with the intent of speeding the drug development timeline and enabling more patients to access clinical trials. Today, we are focusing on just a few of these services. First, genetic counseling and genetic test ordering to support genetic testing access programs. At Genome Medical, we work with biopharma sponsors to craft and implement these programs, and Amy's going to talk about how we've partnered with Ionis to increase access to genetic testing and counseling for 2 different rare disease states. The other service we'll focus on today is our clinical trial matching and recruitment service, and Colleen's going to discuss how we're able to match our patients with rare disease to eligibility criteria and reach out to these patients directly to educate them about these trial opportunities. So let's dive into how genetic counseling can support rare disease patients in getting an accurate diagnosis and access to investigational therapies. And Amy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. So at Ionis, we feel there is a requirement to offer genetic counseling in rare disease. We know there can be gaps across our country, and the utility of telehealth genetic counseling has helped with diagnosis and our investigational therapy screenings. Most of our clinical trials require genetic diagnosis for eligibility. This can be especially confusing for healthcare providers having limited experience with genetic testing, our rare disease, and results such as a VUS or a variant of uncertain significance. Also, many of our pipeline diseases are inherited in an autosomal dominant condition and therefore have implications for their relatives. The facilitation of genetic counseling services for families across the country and even in Canada is essential for supporting patients. Hereditary transthyretin amyloidosis is a rare, adult-onset, progressive, life-threatening disease with heterogeneous presentation of polyneuropathies and cardiomyopathies caused by misfolded amyloid proteins and due to many vague clinical features can be underdiagnosed. This disease required a specific clinical genetic expertise due to result interpretation and being an autosomal dominant disease. Therefore, telehealth genetic counseling was essential. The family member testing facilitation mined a large gap when families were across the country. The genetic counseling by Genome Medical included nearly 10,000 sessions with over 1,000 with TTR gene variant results. Telehealth genetic counseling allowed a larger geographic reach, increasing racial diversity in our clinical trial, including Americans of African ancestry. FUS, fused in sarcoma, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, this ultra-rare genetic form of ALS is progressive and fatal. Genetic testing in ALS is rapidly evolving, and we still know that there is significant underutilization of genetic testing. Genetic counseling is critical, as our clinical trial is specific to this ultra-rare form of genetic ALS and may have uncertain results in the FUS gene. Genome Medical tailored our genetic counseling services for this program with mental health screenings in the genetic counseling sessions, genetic discrimination education, and call center educational support for families and patients. Genome Medical has had nearly 400 patients receive genetic counseling, with only a 3-day wait for an appointment where the average is a 5-day wait. I also want to highlight the uptake of 42% of pre-test genetic counseling. It is ideal for patients to understand their rights, risks, and details of testing before they have a genetic test for ALS. And now I send it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Amy. Hereditary transthyretin amyloidosis and ALS are two disease states where access to genetic testing is so important to determine if people might be eligible for trials and therapies. And it's really impactful to see how genetic counseling as part of these access programs was able to provide patients and physicians needed support and education. I want to take a few moments to speak more generally about how we implement these types of programs at Genome Medical. The goal is always to broaden the funnel of patients that can get access to genetic services so that we ensure patients are achieving an accurate diagnosis. Despite advances in genetic technologies and our understanding of genetic disease, it can be surprising and even frankly shocking to learn how many patients that should have access to testing are actually not getting tested. For example, if we look at cardiovascular disease, Currently, less than 2% of patients that meet consensus-based guidelines for genetic testing are actually getting tested. Why is this? Well, it could be lack of physician awareness or physicians not being comfortable with ordering genetic tests. It could be lack of access to genetic counselors or concerns about the cost of testing, or it could be all of these things. So we set up these programs specifically to overcome these barriers. In a patient-driven model, patients can come to Genome Medical directly without needing to go through their local provider. We provide genetic counseling, order testing if medically appropriate. Medically appropriate testing is often covered by insurance, and if not, we've seen that sponsored programs can really make this a seamless experience for patients by covering the cost of genetic counseling and/or testing. A provider-driven model works well for providers who are comfortable ordering the test, but not as comfortable with interpreting results. In this case, they rely on Genome Medical to provide counseling and interpret any complex results. And for providers who want to receive the results but aren't comfortable deciding which test to order, they can refer their patients to Genome Medical. We provide the counseling, order any medically appropriate testing, and return a results summary to the provider. So we've seen all of these different models really helping to overcome the typical barriers to testing access and get more patients access to the testing and services they need. Amy discussed how Ionis partnered with Genome Medical for the ALS and hereditary amyloidosis programs, which have both been really successful in getting more patients access to genetic services. I also wanted to highlight the breadth of experience Genome Medical has in supporting these types of rare disease testing access programs. We've served more than 14,000 patients in sponsored testing programs across a range of disease states, including cardiology, neurology, and other rare diseases such as immunodeficiencies, auditory conditions, and endocrine disorders, just to name a few. In all cases, we provide genetic counseling and sometimes genetic test ordering as well, with the goal of getting more patients access to genetic testing and services that are appropriate for them. For one of these programs, we conducted a survey earlier this year of physicians who ordered the test as part of the program and referred to Genome Medical for genetic counseling, because we wanted to understand if and how physicians value genetic counseling as part of a sponsored testing program. 73% of the providers we surveyed said that they were more comfortable ordering genetic testing when they knew genetic counseling was available. And one provider even noted, genetic counseling is an essential part of genetic testing. I would be less likely to order the genetic test if your company did not provide this genetic counseling service. Additionally, 82% felt more prepared to discuss the genetic testing results with their patient when they had access to the results summary provided by the genetic counselor. And 64% felt this result summary actually improved their knowledge. So it was really compelling to see how much physicians valued genetic counseling services as part of a genetic testing access program. Ultimately, the most gratifying thing we do at Genome Medical is serve our patients. So I'd be remiss if I didn't share a couple of quotes from patients participating in sponsored testing programs and receiving genetic counseling. My genetic counselor provided a space for me to understand and ask questions. This service has been a highlight that really changed things for me. And I'm extremely grateful the genetic counselor explained everything to me and what to do next concerning my son. He was my biggest concern. It's truly an honor for us at Genome Medical to be a part of these patients' journeys. So now I'd like to switch gears a little bit, where we've discussed how genetic counseling can be a really critical enabler of genetic testing access programs, helping more patients achieve accurate diagnoses so that they can access the right treatments for them. Now we'd like to spend some time discussing how we at Genome Medical are helping our patients with rare diseases get access to clinical trials. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Colleen Kalashu.
Thanks, Sarah. It's great to be here today with you and with Amy. Yeah, so before we get into the work that we're doing to connect our patients with clinical trials, I want to just give you all a sense of who our patients are, which is essentially who we could be connecting with trials. We've seen more than 225,000 patients at Genome Medical, And our rapidly growing patient population is referred to us from a variety of sources. This includes health systems where maybe they don't have any genetic counselors, or they don't have as many genetic counselors as are needed to meet the patient need. We also get patients from diagnostic laboratories like science companies, and many patients come to us directly, finding our website and seeking out the care that they need on their own. We see patients across the country, as already been mentioned, as well as in Canada. Often our patients are coming from more rural areas, or perhaps where they don't have access to an academic medical center or tertiary care center, where, frankly, where most genetic counselors still are in terms of local services. And they come to us, our patients come to us for a variety of reasons, a variety of indications, diagnoses, family histories. About 40% of our patients are coming for oncology-related indications. So this may be that they have a diagnosis of cancer or a family history of cancer that's prompting genetic counseling and testing. And as Sarah mentioned earlier, our fastest growing segment is in rare disease. Right now, about 1/3 of the patients we see are for a rare disease indication. After we've seen patients at Genome Medical, we offer them the opportunity for us to recontact them for clinical trial opportunities that they may be eligible for. And we're seeing consistently that over 90% of our patients are opting into this service. Sarah spoke about the trusted relationship we as genetic counselors have with our patients, and we think this high rate of opting in is really indicative of both that trust as well as patients' interest in clinical trials and therapy opportunities. So I want to share what our solution for clinical trial matching looks like. And it really has two main components. One is leveraging our genetic testing data and longitudinal medical records on our patients, as well as their family histories, to pre-qualify patients and identify those who are likely to be eligible for a trial. And then the other is how we, in a very high-touch way, reach out to these patients to educate them and answer their questions about trial opportunities. So for example, let's say that we are working with a sponsor or a CRO to look for patients with kidney disease, where their kidney disease is caused by a disease-causing variant in a specific gene. We can search through our data to identify patients who have disease-causing variants in that gene, and then we can take those patients and look for those who have the right kidney diagnosis, as well as screening them for additional inclusion/exclusion criteria. In a moment, I'm going to walk you through a couple examples of that. Then, once we've identified a cohort of highly qualified potential participants, we work with our partner, the sponsor or CRO or patient recruitment organization, to develop custom recruitment scripts and materials that are patient-friendly and educational. Using these, one of our clinical team members will reach out directly to the patient, and that may even be the genetic counselor that the patient saw for clinical care originally. And when we reach out to them, we educate them about the trial opportunity and connect them to the next steps for trial enrollment. As I mentioned, our outreach is high touch. It's a series of phone calls and emails directly from our clinical team members. And we find that patients, consistent with that trust they have in their relationship with their genetic counselor, we find that they're very willing to pick up the phone when Genome Medical is calling for these trial engagements. 50% of our patients will answer our clinical trial outreach calls on the first call. So let's walk through a couple of examples. Sarah mentioned at the beginning that my clinical specialty as a genetic counselor is in cardiology. So this first one is actually very dear to my heart. It was a phase 1 gene therapy trial for a rare cardiovascular hereditary disease. And this is a disease that is associated with several different genes. Being a gene therapy trial, the sponsor was looking for patients whose disease was caused by variants in one specific gene, which is, of course, the target for their gene therapy. Only about a fifth of patients with this disease have variants in that gene. And to further make recruitment challenging, genetic testing is vastly underutilized in this disease, with less than 5% of patients receiving genetic testing, despite it being guideline indicated. So all of these things sort of reduce the pool of patients who are out there in the country, out there near sites, at sites, who could be identified to participate in this trial. And then, of course, layered onto that are the non-genetic inclusion and exclusion criteria that further reduce that pool and make it even harder to recruit for. So in terms of what we did together with the sponsor to help them with enrollment, we took our cohort of patients that have disease-causing variants in the gene of interest and then dug into their longitudinal medical records to pre-qualify them and identify the patients who would be appropriate for the trial and likely to be eligible, and then reach out to them. So we've seen over 360 patients with disease-causing variants in the target gene, and 281 of them are within the age range for the trial. We then use the longitudinal medical records to dig into who has the right disease among these patients with the right gene and of the right age. And we found that 102 of them have the relevant disease. Of course, with genetics, the patients who did not have the right disease, some of them had another disease that is associated with this gene, and some of them have healthy hearts but are predisposed and have not yet developed disease, so they weren't appropriate for the trial. And then lastly, we took those 102 patients, and using their medical records, we screened for several critical inclusion and exclusion criteria and found 21 patients that likely meet those criteria and are appropriate for our team to reach out to about this trial. So hopefully this gives you a sense of what the process looks like for us to try and use the data we have on our patients to identify which patients will be appropriate for a trial, thus helping those patients get access to clinical trial opportunities while also helping the sponsor or other partner to find these rare genetic disease patients. I want to walk you through one more example that's sort of earlier in the trial process, in many ways still in the trial planning stage. So in this situation, we were partnering with a CRO, and they came to us while they were in the process of bidding on a trial. This was a study in neurology. The inclusion-exclusion criteria and the protocol had really already been outlined. It was a phase 1 study, but what had not been done yet was fully fleshing out the site locations and selections. So there was a desire to understand where eligible patients were located across the country so that this could help inform site selection. This study happened to be a multi-armed study, and by that I don't mean intervention and control. I mean actually studying 2 different but related diseases within the same trial. And these are 2 rare neurological conditions, both of which have genetic underpinnings. So what we were able to do to support the CRO in their bid was to map out our patients with these diseases across the country and really identify the states that had the largest number of patients. So as you can see on the green panel on the top, for the first of these 2 diseases, we've cared for approximately 700 patients who have that disease, and the distribution across the country and the states that they most frequently live in are listed there to help inform site selection. And then in the blue on the bottom, you can see that same sort of insights and information for the other disease, which is even rarer than the first. And we've cared for approximately 80 patients with that second condition. So this showed that not only did we have patients ready to be recruited for both arms of this study, but it also appealed to the sponsor and that this information could be used to help with site selection. And the great news is that the CRO presented this as part of their patient engagement strategy when making the bid, and they won the bid. So we are looking forward to working with them and the sponsor closely to start outreach for this trial in the coming months. So hopefully those two cases give you a sense of what this work looks like. I also wanted to just give you kind of an overview of the variety of partnerships and treatment areas and types of studies that we have done this for. So we work, as I've mentioned, with sponsors and CROs, as well as patient recruitment organizations to help support trial and enrollment. And it's actually really not just trials. We've mostly focused on them, but we have done this to help with enrollment for observational studies, for synthetic control arms. So it can be a variety of study types. And given the breadth of indications we see patients for, we have supported enrollment across a wide range of therapeutic areas. And then the other thing I want to say is that, our focus today has obviously been on rare genetic disease because that is what our patients come to see us for. But our patients, they are human, and like anyone else, they have just as much of a chance as having other diseases that any one of us can have that are not necessarily genetic and aren't the reason that they come to Genome Medical, like say asthma or lupus. So we've actually also worked with partners to connect our patients to trials for these these non-genetic, non-rare diseases that they also have. So if you are interested in finding out if we care for patients with your disease of interest or your gene of interest, so that we could consider working together to help support your study enrollment, we'd be happy to pull those numbers for you. You can either scan this QR code or you can follow the URL that's below it and let us know what you're looking for, and we will look into our patient cohort and get back to you.
Great. Thank you, Colleen. It's really been a pleasure to collaborate with sponsors, CROs, patient recruitment organizations, and helping them achieve enrollment goals. What's even more gratifying is being able to offer this service to our patients and connect them to trial opportunities that they may not otherwise be aware of. And we've received such a positive response from the patients and families we speak with about these trial opportunities. And it's really just amazing to be a part of these collaborations that we think really have the potential to accelerate rare disease drug development. So now we're going to enter into the panel discussion portion of the webinar. I have a few questions teed up to pose to Amy and Colleen, but I want to welcome both of you to jump in at any time. I'm sure I'll be jumping in with some thoughts as well. So first, I have a question for Amy. I mentioned in my slides a survey that Genome Medical conducted with providers that were referring their patients to genetic counseling as part of a sponsored testing program. And as a reminder, 73% of the providers we surveyed said that they were more comfortable ordering genetic testing when they knew genetic counseling was available. Additionally, 82% felt more prepared to discuss the genetic testing results with their patient when they had access to the results summary provided by the genetic counselor. I'm curious what feedback, if any, Ionis has gotten from providers about genetic counseling as part of these testing programs.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, we did receive feedback at a few sites that have an adult neurogenetic counselor on site, and that they didn't have the bandwidth to see all of their patients, including satellite locations, for both pre and or post-test genetic counseling sessions. So they mentioned that they really appreciated having the option for telehealth genetic counseling. We also heard feedback for the family genetic counseling, as most sites can't manage family members remotely due to licensure restrictions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really a benefit of a telemedicine model at Genome Medical. We have genetic counselors licensed in all states that require it, so we can easily serve family members. And especially, with many of these, as you mentioned, Amy, many of these conditions that are autosomal dominant, we of course want to be able to offer family members access to testing as well, no matter where they live. Great. Well, we've been discussing how providers seem to really value the role of genetic counselors in genetic testing access programs. What about in terms of clinical trial outreach and education? Colleen, can you share a bit how genetic counselors are really uniquely primed to educate patients about clinical trials, especially those involving gene therapies?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, which is the most important thing, which is the feedback that we get from patients. They're very grateful to get these calls. They're very grateful to know that we are thinking of them and we are looking for these opportunities for them, which I think is just a great indicator of what that interaction is like with the clinical team on the call about a trial, as well as the trust they have in us and their desire, their eagerness for new opportunities for trials or novel therapies. And of course, we all know that the vast majority of rare genetic diseases, they don't have any treatment. So some of these patients and families, they're just incredibly eager, even desperate to find out about these things. And then finding out about them from a group where they have a lot of trust in them, as we talked about, that idea of, your genetic counselor talks to you about something that can be really hard and really important and really life-changing, like, your child getting a genetic diagnosis, which explains what's been going on for so long, but also tells you some things that are coming in the future and maybe some bad news. And, as genetic counselors in our job title, we're not just about genetic tests. And a big part of our work is building that empathic relationship with families when we see them and helping them process the personal and emotional and family ramifications of a genetic disease or diagnosis. So I think that relationship really carries through to when we then reach out to them about clinical trial. And then I guess the other thing I'd say is, we are trained as genetic counselors in how to understand complex and nuanced genetic and medical and scientific information and then translate it in an incredibly lay-friendly, accessible way and often tailored to the specific patient or family. And when we're talking about things like gene therapy in particular, to most people, this is sort of science fiction. And, it's becoming a reality. And, we're in a great position as genetic counselors to help them and frankly, their providers who aren't at centers of excellence specialized in gene therapy to help both of the patients and providers really understand what that involves and what a trial involves.
Yeah, I love all the points you raise. And Amy, when we were prepping for this webinar, you had mentioned, alluding to Colleen's comment about science fiction, that we're in the Star Wars with a period of genetics. And in many ways we are. It's really exciting to see these advances and clinical trial opportunities opening up for gene therapies. But the decision to participate in a clinical trial, especially with a novel therapy, is really complex. And I think, genetic counselors, we have a unique role. We've been trained to educate people about the benefits and limitations of genetic testing and explain these complex concepts. So it's really natural that we can have that role in explaining gene therapies and talking about the benefits of participating in clinical trials and really having that robust discussion with patients and families, keeping in mind their experiences and their points of view, right, in making these decisions. Great. Well, I have another question for Amy. Something that I really appreciate about these genetic testing access programs that we've been talking about is the level of collaboration involved between Ionis as the sponsor and Genome Medical as the genetic service provider. So Amy, I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about how that collaboration and that relationship really drives learnings and metrics that support the value of these programs.
Yeah, so genetic counseling really, it brings a personalized discussion about disease and diagnosis. And the genetic counselors at Genome Medical, they make sure to discuss options with patients that Colleen was alluding to. And that's for next steps to discuss with their healthcare provider, and just really having that detailed clinical note for follow-up. These discussions could be a clinical trial or a next step for an unclear result, like the VUS I mentioned earlier in the presentation. And the consideration of different types of follow-up studies, like family or segregation studies. We want patients to have a resource that is personalized. And specifically regarding our collaboration, we meet regularly to discuss program metrics, as well as feedback that's collected from genetic counselors and the support staff at Genome Medical, as well as any comments we hear from patients or providers utilizing the program. Through this process, we've heard that sessions for patients with positive results were understandably more challenging, especially related to ensuring ample time to address topics related to informing family members of the diagnosis and supporting cascade counseling and testing. One outcome of this collaboration is the strategy to better support patients and their families. As you heard in the presentation, our adult onset diseases, both hATTR amyloidosis and FUS-ALS, can have implications for children, siblings, and parents. And Genome Medical can schedule a follow-up session to further explore the family impact and offer short-term support around sharing information with relatives and provide additional psychosocial counseling. This resource for the patient and their extended family is fully aligned with our mission to save and improve lives of people living with serious diseases.
Really appreciate all of that, Amy. And, having worked with you on some of these programs and seen some of these patients, in terms of collaboration, it's been really great the way that at the start of a program, we've been able to work together, particularly on our side, our clinical science liaisons, who are genetic counselors and genetic counselors who have the right disease expertise for the given disease state, and working really closely with you and your team to make sure we set up a counseling program and an education and support program that really fits the specific needs for that disease and those patients and families. And then the way that, keeping in touch and monitoring progress in the program has informed some of the things you just mentioned around realizing that, there's this need that we're not currently meeting, say, family members or additional follow-up counseling. Let's evolve the program and let's figure out how to further customize it in a way that meets that need.
Yeah, I think that collaboration and really the meeting of the minds between, really experts in this disease state, both on the therapeutic side and on the genetics and provider side is like the secret sauce, right? Because we can share metrics and understand barriers and really and overcome those barriers over time. Well, I have a similar collaboration question for you, Colleen. So on the trial recruitment side, how does Genome Medical work closely with the sponsor, really leveraging expertise from both organizations to maximize successful outcomes with trial matching and recruitment?
Yeah, we had spoke just a couple minutes ago about the kind of conversations genetic counselors can have with patients about trials, and the way that our particular expertise and training sets us up well to do that. And I actually had this in the back of my mind at the time because it is really important to emphasize that what our clinical team says to patients when we reach out to them about a trial opportunity is really designed very carefully in close collaboration with the partner, be it a sponsor or a CRO or whatnot. Because of course, we want to make sure that we are learning everything that the sponsor has already sorted out about how best to talk to patients about this, as well as all of the potential regulatory considerations about how the trial is discussed. So what that looks like is very early in the engagement, collaborating closely on what will the outreach script look like that the clinical team will use when they call these patients. And then, prior to that in the process, I should say, of first we find the patients that are pre-qualified, then we call them and email them, right? But the patient finding, patient identification process is also something that's very collaborative about, what in particular are we looking for in the data we have on patients? Which inclusion exclusion criteria does it make sense for us to screen for in the longitudinal medical records versus which really need to be evaluated at the site? And the other thing that I think it's important, I'm not sure I mentioned earlier, is that, many existing sort of patient recruitment efforts out there rely a lot on patient report to determine if a patient might be eligible for sort of that pre-screening. That can be particularly tricky for rare genetic disease because there may be aspects of their disease that the patients actually, for very understandable reasons, can't self-report. So working with the sponsor together to figure out, what are the things we're going to look for in the medical records and the genetic test reports. And many of those things are things that if the patient was asked directly, they wouldn't be able to provide. And then they might lose out on that trial opportunity, or they might, answer in a way that's different from what their doctor's actually seeing, just because of, what is salient to a patient and what's salient to a doctor and in the records. So that's something that I think of as well. And then, the last thing that comes to mind is that there's also potential for us to share the things we're hearing from patients with our partner. Why are they hesitant? What is it, the questions that they are asking? Because it can be really valuable to get those insights so we can then, work together on, for the remainder of the program, how to address those for patients. And sometimes it might even inform a protocol amendment, or say an adjustment to exclusion criteria, or an understanding of an education program that's needed for providers or patients.
Yeah, those patient-reported insights are so important in terms of designing trials and potentially making adjustments to protocols and IE criteria and learning for future trials, right? So I love all the things you pointed out in terms of the collaboration in finding and identifying the right patients, to collaborating on the outreach scripts and how we want to talk about the trial and communicate the trial to patients, then to actually analyzing those metrics, analyzing what patients and families are saying so that we can improve the process moving forward. So all great collaboration pieces. Well, I think we're going to wrap up the panel discussion, and thank you to anyone who submitted questions in the audience. We will be following up with answers and responses to those questions. I wanted to give a huge thanks to Colleen and Amy for joining me today. It was just really fun to speak with both of you, and I am and speak about the way we've worked together, and I hope for many more collaborations to come. Thank you, everyone, for joining today.
Thank you for attending this Fierce Biotech webinar and submitting so many great questions. Special thanks to our speakers for participating, and Genome Medical for presenting today's webinar. A recorded version of this webinar will be available for you to access within 24 hours. Just use that same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining. We look forward to seeing you at future events.